The last I saw of Count Dracula was his kissing his hand to me with the red light of triumph in his eyes, and with a smile that Judas in hell might be proud of.
Vampires, the restless undead creatures of the night that can transform and suck blood. What is it about these creatures that appeals so deeply to the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community? Sorry, these teeth are coming out because I can't even speak with them. From the ancient Greek empusa, which was a creature with one copper leg and one leg of a donkey, to the sasabonsum of the Ashanti people with hook-like hands that would hang down from trees, and the snake-like lamia, vampire-like creatures may not always look exactly the same, but they have existed in cultures around the world and throughout time. In many religions past and present, love and sex are embodied in gods and goddesses. In the ancient Greeks, it was Aphrodite who would be worshipped. She was a sexual entity, embodied in the form of a woman. But with the advent of Christianity, this symbolism became pagan and, well, very unpopular. And some of the traits associated with these gods, whether Greek or Roman or Celtic, became demonic. And these traits you can see within the lascivious nature of vampires. One of the biblical origins of vampires is that they relate to the very first wife of Adam. Before Eve, in some stories, there is a woman called Lilith. Now, Lilith was created to be Adam's wife in the Garden of Eden, but she disobeyed. She would not do as she was told. So she was cast out of Eden and transformed into a succubus. Now, a succubus is a kind of feminine demon that drains the life force, often from men and children, and is incredibly sexual. It is said that the children of Lilith themselves became demons and vampires. So for this reason alone, you can see how the vampire could become a powerful symbol for women that don't obey the rules, and this would include lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer women. Now, even before Dracula was written, one of the very first vampiric protagonists was a book written by Le Fanu, and the character was called Carmilla. She was a lesbian vampiric contessa. The lesbian vampire has become a bit of a trope, and often it is used in campy films, generally to titillate a heterosexual audience, but it's also been reclaimed by the queer community. And the aesthetic of vampires, which is a kind of decaying opulence, old castles, gothic grandeur, a kind of feminine masculinity, has been used by a lot of lesbian and queer women. Here's an example of a ring owned by a member of the Kenrick Society. This was a group of lesbian women who would wear this ring to show and identify each other. Now, none of these women were vampires, but the aesthetic of a kind of gothic opulence, a regal persuasion, is something that some members of the lesbian community still aspire to. But where did this gothic aesthetic come from? Originally, vampires were bestial, they were monsters, they were creatures. So how did they become refined? Well, one of the arguments relates to Lord Byron. So Byron himself, a famous historical figure who was bisexual and bodacious, not exactly someone to be revered. He was aggressive, violent, and incestuous as well. But his story resonated throughout history. Byron's stormy temperament and wild passions made him a scandalous and not exactly beloved character, but someone that people would consume media of, read about him in the press. And then when he went on to pen his own story, Vampire, the two images of the decaying creature, ancient and ageless, and Lord Byron, this sexual deviant who was mysterious and charming, kind of became synonymous. So now not just a monster, the vampire is wealthy, eccentric, sometimes a lord or a dandy. Have a look at this costume. This is from the museum's collection, and it is from a play based on the story Vampire written by Byron. Now, the play depicts these vampires not as fanged monsters, but as debonair, charismatic, and hypersexual. So from the 19th century onwards, we start to see a real shift in the depiction of vampires. From being monstrous creatures that barely look human at all, one of the dangerous things about a vampire becomes the fact that they can pass as human. In fact, often they are beautiful to behold. You're much more likely to see a vampire depicted as a refined gentleman or a well-dressed lady from the 19th century onwards. In the 1930s, something was introduced which is known as the Hays Code. This affected how Hollywood would portray people in movies, the idea being that you couldn't show a character that was morally abject in a positive light, for fear that this would influence particularly young people and families. Now, as queer people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, were seen as morally abject, they could not ever be depicted in a film in a favourable light, for fear of coming up against the Hays Code. But one way of getting around this and still having camp and flamboyant characters in your stories was creating films where the bad guys are queer coded. This means that they are not explicitly shown to be gay, bisexual, or transgender, but they use character traits commonly associated with our community. And this is why so many creatures of the night are so flamboyant. Therefore, even though old Hollywood vampires are very rarely fully out of the coffin, we as a queer community can see those character traits borrowed from us, and in a sense, we feel reflected in them. Also, we see a creature that is reviled, often chased out of the town by villagers wielding pitchforks, which is not too far from some of our own experiences of persecution. And let's not forget how vampires are created. Another vampire has to embrace you first, which again applies to how many people have seen LGBTQ people, that we convert others. Also, the symbolism of blood becomes very important. Obviously, during the HIV crisis, blood, particularly gay and bisexual men's blood, would be seen as poisonous and dirty. It was something we didn't fully understand, but we knew that this illness that was killing us was being transferred from man to man through an embrace. The depictions of vampires have been inspired by many things, whether from a woman disobeying her husband, or from an older eccentric gentleman living by himself as a bachelor. These kind of things would inspire these stories. And all the way to today, when we see sparkly camp vampires in Twilight, or the dominatrix demigods of Anne Rice novels, these characters have a deep queer aesthetic. So to this day, whether in our costumes, fancy dress, or daydreams, we, the queer people, are the true children of the night.